So let's take a quick look at using MongoDB inside Node. And there's a few ways to do that, but by far the most popular, and perhaps the most powerful, is an NPM package called Mongoose. You can find out a lot more about Mongo by going to mongodb.com. And there you can also download MongoDB and install it on your local computer. And there's instructions there on how to do that. Now, for the purposes of this course, I wanted to quickly be able to set up a MongoDB database and show you the contents. One nice way to do this was by going to mongolab.com, which provides me a very simple and easy way to create a MongoDB out on the cloud. And after I signed up for MongoLab, I could go ahead and create a new database, but when I created a new database, I created what was called a single node, which is free. It's 500 megabytes. So I could just create a free database just to learn to mess around with Mongo. And if you like to use MongoLab or one of the other cloud storages that has a small free database available, you can do that too instead of installing it locally. That's up to you. But I'm going to use MongoLab because I can easily show you the contents of the database. I made a new database called Address Book, and right now it's empty. It also gave me a URL to connect to, which I can use in my code. I'm not worried about showing you this because by the time you watch these lectures, this database will have been deleted. All right, so let's take a look. The NPM package we'll be using is the very popular Mongoose, which is designed for dealing with MongoDB and doing it in a very consistent, clean way. I can install it with npm install mongoose, and I would simply then require Mongoose, and I can connect using the MongoDB URL. MongoLab gave me one, or you might have your own localhost URL if you installed it locally, or at 127.0.0.1 instead of localhost, sometimes depending on your setup. But whatever the case is, you can connect to your MongoDB, and then you set up what's called a schema, meaning this is what my objects will look like. This is what my document will look like. And then that schema essentially becomes almost like a function constructor inside Node. So I can create new objects and then save them directly to the database. And remember, we're not saving to tables. We're saving all of the data, including the structure, in a format that's essentially like JSON that MongoDB calls BSON. Let's just give this a try so we can see why this works so well in connection with Node.js. So I'll install the package npm install mongoose and save it to my package.json. It'll take a moment to load, and once it's in your node_modules, that's it. You're ready to go. Now I've loaded some code into my little messing around app here. I've removed the code that had to do with MySQL. There was some code that was just down in the middleware and the require MySQL, and instead I'm requiring Mongoose and saving that. And then, as according to the documentation for Mongoose, I can connect to the URL. Now MongoLab gave me a URL, and you can use whatever URL is for your database. Mine is username:password @ and then my MongoDB URL, including the name of the database there. Now, I've already put this code in here because we're more interested in understanding why Mongo works so well with Node, as opposed to maybe typing all this out. But you're certainly welcome to look at the code and try this for yourself. Now, first, Mongoose provides this constructor called schema. So I'll just set a variable for it, mongoose.schema. This lets me define the structure of a document. So I can say I want this new schema, and I give it a JavaScript object, and I give it the names of the properties and the types of data that they'll store. And there's a variety of types. In our case, it's just strings. First name, last name, address is all we want to store. Once I have this schema, I can then generate a function constructor. What is essentially a function constructor, but we don't use it exactly the same way. but it does generate objects. It is a constructor. And mongoose.model lets me give it a name, and then the schema. So in other words, what do we expect from the objects that we're going to create using this schema? What's the structure? And then I can create new instances or new versions of this object, this type of object that follows this structure. So again, I created a schema that said what should the properties be and what types of data, which allowed me to then create this function which will generate objects that are Mongoose objects that will then allow me to store the data in MongoDB. And then I start creating individual objects. These will be individual documents ultimately. So John is a person, and unlike a function constructor, I don't say new. I just give it the object that I want to save. So first name, last name, address. But because I called this person function, and person is a model, then any object returning back from person will have some methods on it, like save. So .save will save this document into that proper area in MongoDB as expected by that particular schema, that structure. So I can call .save on my new object and give it a callback. And if there's an error, I can handle it. Otherwise, I'm just going to console.log that the person was saved. And I'll create a Jane object. Do the same thing. She's a person. I give it an actual object literal, storing the data. It matches the structure. And then I save. And then what I did was a bit later in the middleware for when we load the web page, I just wanted to console.log the query where I go and ask for the data. In this case, I'm just asking for everything. In here, I could potentially put specific queries, things that I'm looking for. And then I'm going to output what I get back. So all I'm doing is setting up the structure, putting in a couple pieces of data, and getting data out. Let's go ahead and just run this. And I'll just run node app.js, and I get 2 person saved logs. So they both saved. And I'll go to localhost 3000 to cause the middleware to run. And there it is. I got back from MongoDB via Mongoose JavaScript objects, an array. Now MongoDB provided an ID for me, so I didn't need to add one myself. And notice that I have the data. Now if I go over to MongoLab and refresh to see what's inside here, I have a collection. That was that person schema. And inside of it, I have multiple documents. It's not a table. I don't have rows. Each document contains everything, both the structure and the data. And when I queried it, it gave me this back. And notice this looks very similar to JSON. That's how Mongo stores data. It's a document database, and each one of these is a document. And I can query it. I can say, find me one where the first name is this, or find me one where the address is this, etc. Or where something is greater than or less than, or the normal things we're used to when querying information about data. And that was very simple. But what's so great about this is that the structure that Mongo stores data in is very similar to the way that JavaScript stores data in objects. Each object has its own structure, its name-value pair, its properties. And so if inside my document database, one of these documents had a slightly different structure than the other, it's not going to complain. JavaScript is fine with that because each object stands alone, but all of them can sit inside the same array, even if each object is different. So I could get back a variety of objects with different or slightly different structures, and I can just use that in JavaScript without any problems. So the idea here is that the way Mongo stores data ties very nicely to JavaScript itself and the way Node then is going to work with objects. It's very simple to simply say, here's my data, and pass it along for the ride, and give me some data and get it back, and just work with it very naturally. It's kind of similar to MySQL, but we're also gaining the advantage of being able to change our structure on the fly because it's a NoSQL approach to storing data. The data, each document, also stores its own structure with it. Does that make sense? So this is why Mongo and Node together is very popular. But you certainly don't have to use Mongo with Node. But you can, and there's this terrific NPM package called Mongoose that makes it a lot easier to do.